On August 27, 1941, in a field just outside Kamianets-Podilskyi, Ukraine, a Jewish mother stood at the edge of a massive bomb crater, holding her 6-month-old baby. Behind her stood thousands of other Jews, entire families stripped naked in the summer heat. German SS officers shouted orders, while Ukrainian auxiliary police formed a corridor with rifles. Then, the shooting began. Machine guns fired in bursts. Bodies fell forward into the crater, tumbling down onto those already dead below. The mother tried to shield her baby, but bullets ripped through them both. They fell together into the pit. The shooting continued without stopping. 10 people at a time were brought to the edge, shot, and their bodies fell. Another 10. Then another. The process repeated for hours, through the night, and into the next day. By the evening of August 28th, over 23,600 Jews were dead, their bodies stacked in layers inside bomb craters that had been dug by the Soviets just months before. This was the Kamianets-Podilskyi massacre, and it marked a horrifying turning point in the Holocaust. For the first time, the Nazis systematically murdered entire Jewish families, babies, children, mothers, fathers, and grandparents, all together. If this story makes your blood run cold, if you can't comprehend how humans could commit such evil, then like this video, subscribe to our channel, and comment below. Share this so these victims are never forgotten. Because what happened at Kamianets-Podilskyi wasn't just mass murder. It was the blueprint for the industrial genocide that would kill over 1.5 million more Jews across Eastern Europe. Now let me take you back to August 1941 to understand how this massacre became the first family extermination of the Holocaust.
To understand the Kamianets-Podilskyi massacre, we must first understand the context of Operation Barbarossa and the escalation of Nazi genocide in summer 1941. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union with over 3 million troops. Behind the advancing army came the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads composed of SS officers, police, and soldiers, whose orders were to execute communist officials, political commissars, and Jews. In the first weeks of the invasion, the Einsatzgruppen primarily targeted Jewish men of military age, claiming they were potential partisans or Soviet sympathizers. Women, children, and the elderly were initially spared, though they were forced into ghettos and subjected to brutal living conditions. But by August 1941, the killing policy was about to change dramatically. The city of Kamianets-Podilskyi, located in southwestern Ukraine near the pre-war border with Romania, was captured by German forces on July 11, 1941. Before the war, it had been home to approximately 14,000 Jews. The Jewish community was ancient, dating back to the 14th century, and the city featured a beautiful historic fortress and vibrant cultural life. As German forces advanced, something unexpected happened. In late July 1941, Hungary, Germany's ally, decided to cleanse its territory of foreign Jews, mostly Polish and Russian refugees who had fled to Hungary before the war. Hungarian authorities rounded up approximately 14,000 to 18,000 Jewish refugees and deported them across the border into German-occupied Ukraine. These Jews were loaded into freight cars, taken to the border town of Korozmezo, now Yesinia, and handed over to German authorities. The deportees, many still traveling as family units, were then forced to march over 100 kilometers from the border town of Kolomia to Kamianets-Podilskyi. The march was brutal. People walked for days under the summer sun with little food or water. The elderly collapsed and were shot where they fell. Children cried from exhaustion. By the time they reached Kamianets-Podilskyi in early August, hundreds had already died.
Jeckeln was an experienced SS commander who had already overseen mass shootings of Jews in other parts of Ukraine. He was known for his efficiency, his ruthlessness, and his development of a systematic method for mass executions that would later bear his name, the Jeckeln method. Jeckeln arrived in Kamianets-Podilskyi in late August and immediately began planning the operation. He assembled a killing force composed of Einsatzgruppen units, German Police Battalion 320, Hungarian soldiers, and Ukrainian auxiliary police, approximately 1,500 men in total. The plan was simple but horrifying. They would execute the entire Jewish population of Kamianets in a single operation. On August 25, 1941, German soldiers informed the Jewish population that they would be relocated to a new area for their safety. They were ordered to gather on August 27th at designated assembly points, bringing only essential belongings. Many Jews suspected something terrible was about to happen, but they had nowhere to run. The city was surrounded by German troops, and any Jew caught trying to escape was shot on sight. On the morning of August 27th, thousands of Jews assembled as ordered. German and Ukrainian police formed corridors and began marching the Jews out of the city toward the northwest. The destination was a series of massive bomb craters located in fields about 8 to 10 kilometers outside the city. These craters had been created by Soviet bombs during earlier fighting and were now perfect mass graves, deep, wide, and ready-made. As the columns of Jews marched out of the city, local Ukrainian residents watched from their homes. Some felt pity. Others looted the homes that Jews had left behind. The march took several hours. Families stayed together, mothers carrying infants, fathers holding the hands of children, elderly grandparents helped by their relatives. They still didn't know they were walking to their deaths.
When the first groups of Jews arrived at the bomb craters on August 27, 1941, they were confronted with a scene of organized horror. German SS officers and Ukrainian auxiliary police had cordoned off the area. Machine gun positions had been set up at the edges of the craters. Armed guards formed a perimeter, preventing anyone from escaping. The killing operation was organized with terrifying efficiency, using what would become known as the Jeckeln method. This systematic approach to mass murder would later be replicated at Babi Yar and hundreds of other massacre sites across Eastern Europe, ultimately claiming over 1.5 million lives. The process worked as follows. First, the victims were ordered to hand over all valuables, money, jewelry, watches, and documents. They were collected in piles and would later be sent back to Germany. Second, they were forced to remove all their clothing. Entire families stood naked in the open field, humiliated and terrified. The clothing was sorted and stacked. It too would be shipped to Germany or distributed to ethnic German settlers. Third, the victims were divided into groups of approximately 10 to 20 people. Each group was marched to the edge of the bomb crater where German and Ukrainian shooters stood with rifles and machine guns. The victims were ordered to stand at the very edge of the crater facing away from the shooters. Then, without warning, the shooting began. Bullets struck the victims in the back of the head and upper back. They fell forward into the crater, their bodies tumbling down the steep sides to land on top of those already dead below. This method was designed for efficiency. By having victims stand at the edge and shooting them in the back, gravity did the work of disposing of the bodies. There was no need to carry or drag corpses. The bodies simply fell into the mass grave. After each group was shot, the next group was immediately brought forward. The process continued without interruption, like a grotesque assembly line of death. But the reality was far more chaotic and horrifying than this cold description suggests. Witnesses who survived by hiding nearby later testified about what they saw and heard. The shooting went on for hours without stopping. The sound of machine guns and rifles echoed across the fields. Screams filled the air, the cries of children, the prayers of the elderly, the desperate pleas of parents trying to protect their children. Many victims were not killed instantly. Wounded people fell into the crater still alive, crying out in pain as more bodies fell on top of them. Some tried to crawl out, but were shot again or pushed back in. Children clung to their parents as bullets tore through them. Mothers held babies in their arms, trying to shield them, but the bullets went through both.
Some infants were simply thrown alive into the craters to save ammunition. German officers walked along the edge of the crater with pistols, shooting anyone who was still moving. The Jeckeln method required that each layer of bodies be arranged neatly before the next group was shot. But in the chaos and speed of the killing, bodies simply piled on top of each other in twisted, horrible heaps. As the day progressed, the bomb craters began to fill with corpses. Blood pooled at the bottom and seeped into the ground. The smell of death, gunpowder, and human waste became overwhelming. By the evening of August 27, 1941, approximately 10,000 people had been murdered. But the shooting did not stop. It continued through the night under floodlights that the Germans had set up. Local residents living kilometers away could hear the gunfire echoing through the darkness. Some tried to sleep with pillows over their ears. Others lay awake listening to the sounds of mass murder. The next morning, August 28th, the killing resumed. More Jews were marched from the city to the craters. The process repeated exactly as before: undressing, lining up at the edge, shooting, bodies falling. Children who had been hidden by their parents in the city were found and brought to the killing site. Elderly Jews who could not walk were loaded onto carts and brought to the craters, then shot at the edge. By the afternoon of August 28, 1941, the craters were nearly full. Bodies were stacked so high that the shooters had difficulty seeing over them. German soldiers had to climb down into the craters and walk over the corpses to shoot wounded survivors. The ground around the craters was covered with blood, shell casings, and discarded personal belongings. Finally, by the evening of August 28, 1941, the shooting stopped. SS Commander Friedrich Jeckeln compiled his report and sent it to headquarters. The report stated, on August 27th and 28th, 1941, a total of 23,600 Jews were executed. This number included approximately 14,000 Jews deported from Hungary and nearly 10,000 local Jews from the city itself. Entire families had been wiped out. Babies, children, teenagers, parents, and grandparents, all murdered together in just 48 hours. After the shooting ended, German soldiers used explosives to collapse the sides of the bomb craters, burying the bodies under earth and rubble. But the graves were so full that the ground continued to move for days as the bodies decomposed. Blood seeped through the soil and formed pools on the surface. The smell of death hung over the area for weeks.
The Kamianets-Podilskyi massacre marked a crucial turning point in the Holocaust and the Nazi genocide of Jews. For the first time, German forces had systematically murdered entire Jewish families, not just men of military age, but women, children, and infants. This represented a decisive shift in Nazi killing policy, from selective murder to total extermination. Before Kamianets-Podilskyi, the Einsatzgruppen had primarily targeted Jewish men, claiming they were potential threats or partisans. But in August 1941, the killing expanded to include everyone. This change did not happen by accident. It was the result of a deliberate decision made at the highest levels of Nazi leadership. The success of the Kamianets-Podilskyi operation, measured in Nazi terms by the number of people killed and the efficiency of the method, convinced SS leadership that mass murder of entire Jewish populations was feasible. Friedrich Jeckelin's systematic approach, the method of undressing victims, lining them at crater edges, and shooting them so bodies fell naturally into mass graves, proved that large numbers of people could be killed quickly with minimal resources. Just 1 month after Kamianets-Podilskyi, on September 29-30, 1941, the same Friedrich Jeckeln ordered and oversaw the massacre at Babi Yar near Kyiv, where 33,771 Jews were murdered in 2 days using the exact same method. The Jeckeln method became the standard operating procedure for mass shootings across occupied Eastern Europe. In the months following Kamianets-Podilskyi, similar massacres occurred throughout Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. The Einsatzgruppen, police battalions, and local auxiliary forces murdered hundreds of thousands of Jews using the techniques pioneered at Kamianets-Podilskyi. By the end of 1941, over 500,000 Jews had been shot to death in what became known as the Holocaust by bullets. The psychological impact on the killers, however, became a growing concern for Nazi leadership. Many German soldiers and police officers suffered from depression, alcoholism, and mental breakdowns after participating in mass shootings. The face-to-face nature of the killings, standing just meters away from victims, including women and children, and shooting them repeatedly, took a severe toll. SS officers reported that many men needed alcohol to carry out the shootings and that some refused to participate. This led Nazi leaders to search for more efficient and psychologically distant methods of killing. By late 1941, experiments with mobile gas vans began, and by 1942, the construction of death camps with gas chambers was underway. But even as the killing methods evolved, the mass shootings continued throughout the war. By 1945, approximately 1.5 million Jews had been murdered by shooting, buried in mass graves across Eastern Europe. Back in Kamianets-Podilskyi, life continued for the Ukrainian residents who had witnessed the massacre. The Germans established a small ghetto for approximately 4,800 Jews who had been deemed useful for labor and had been spared during the August massacre. But this was only a temporary reprieve. Over the following months, these remaining Jews were also murdered in smaller operations. Local residents knew what had happened at the bomb craters, but fear and collaboration kept most silent. Some Ukrainians had participated in the killings as auxiliary police. Others had looted Jewish homes and property. And all lived under brutal German occupation where speaking out meant death. In 1943, as German forces began retreating from Ukraine in the face of Soviet advances, they attempted to cover up evidence of the massacre. Special units were sent to Kamianets-Podilskyi to exhume the mass graves and burn the bodies. Prisoners, usually Jews or Soviet POWs, were forced to dig up the decomposed corpses, stack them on pyres, and burn them. The prisoners who carried out this work were then murdered to eliminate witnesses. But the cover-up was incomplete. When Soviet forces recaptured Kamianets-Podilskyi in March 1944, they found evidence of the massacre: bone fragments, shell casings, and personal belongings scattered around the former killing sites. Soviet investigators documented the atrocity and collected testimony from local witnesses. However, in the Soviet historical narrative, the victims were usually described as peaceful Soviet citizens, without specifying that they were Jews. This pattern of downplaying the Jewish identity of Holocaust victims was common in Soviet historiography throughout the Cold War era. For decades after the war, the Kamianets-Podilskyi massacre remained relatively unknown outside of Ukraine and Holocaust scholarship. It was overshadowed by more famous atrocities like Babi Yar and the death camps. The massacre site itself had no memorial, and grass grew over the bomb craters where 23,600 people had been murdered.
After World War II ended, efforts began to document Nazi war crimes and bring perpetrators to justice. Friedrich Jeckeln, the SS commander who organized the Kamianets-Podilskyi massacre, was captured by Soviet forces in 1945. He was tried by a Soviet military tribunal in Riga, Latvia, in 1946 for his role in multiple mass killings, including Kamianets-Podilskyi, Babi Yar, and massacres in Latvia. Jeckeln was found guilty and sentenced to death. He was hanged publicly in Riga on February 3, 1946. However, most of the men who participated in the actual shooting, members of Police Battalion 320, Einsatzgruppen units, and Ukrainian auxiliary police, were never prosecuted. Some were killed during the war. Others returned to civilian life in Germany or Ukraine and were never identified or charged. A few were later tried in German courts in the 1960s and 1970s, but the vast majority escaped justice entirely. The question of local collaboration remains controversial. Ukrainian auxiliary police played a significant role in the Kamianets-Podilskyi massacre, helping to guard victims, march them to the killing sites, and in some cases participating directly in the shooting. After the war, Soviet authorities executed some Ukrainian collaborators, but many others were never identified.
This history of collaboration complicates Ukraine's relationship with its World War II past, as the country struggles to balance remembering the Holocaust with acknowledging the role some Ukrainians played in Nazi crimes. For decades after the war, the Kamianets-Podilskyi massacre was largely forgotten. There was no memorial at the killing site, no museum, and very little international awareness. The Soviet Union's policy of describing Holocaust victims as peaceful Soviet citizens without mentioning they were Jews meant that the specifically anti-Jewish nature of the massacre was obscured. This began to change after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Independent Ukraine began to confront its Holocaust history more openly. In the 1990s and 2000s, historians conducted extensive research on the Kamianets-Podilskyi massacre, interviewing the few remaining survivors and witnesses, examining German and Soviet archives, and conducting archaeological surveys of the killing sites. In 2000, a memorial was finally erected at the site of the massacre. It consists of a menorah monument and plaques describing what happened there in August 1941. Every year, survivors, descendants, and Holocaust remembrance organizations gather at the site to commemorate the victims. Today, the Kamianets-Podilskyi massacre is recognized by Holocaust scholars as one of the pivotal moments in the escalation of Nazi genocide. It demonstrated that the mass murder of entire Jewish populations was logistically feasible. It pioneered killing methods that would be used across Eastern Europe, and it marked the transition from selective killing to total extermination. The massacre also serves as a reminder of the Holocaust by bullets, the mass shooting operations that killed 1.5 million Jews across Eastern Europe between 1941 and 1945. While the death camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka are more famous, the reality is that a significant portion of Holocaust victims were murdered not in gas chambers, but by bullets. Shot at the edges of ravines, pits, and bomb craters, their bodies buried in unmarked mass graves. One of the most haunting aspects of the Kamianets-Podilskyi massacre is how quickly it was carried out. In just 48 hours, 23,600 people were murdered, nearly 500 people per hour, or one person every 7 seconds. This industrial scale of killing, achieved with nothing more than rifles and machine guns, demonstrates how efficient genocide can be when organized systematically. The massacre also raises profound questions about human nature and moral responsibility. The men who carried out the shooting were not all fanatical Nazis. Many were ordinary police officers, soldiers, and local auxiliaries, yet they participated in the murder of babies, children, and families without significant resistance. This pattern of ordinary people committing extraordinary evil when ordered to do so is one of the most disturbing lessons of the Holocaust. For the descendants of survivors, the Kamianets-Podilskyi massacre remains a source of profound trauma. Entire family trees were erased in those 2 days in August 1941. Many survivors never spoke about what they witnessed, carrying the trauma silently for the rest of their lives. Today, as the last survivors and witnesses pass away, it becomes even more critical to preserve their testimony and ensure that the massacre is not forgotten. The Kamianets-Podilskyi massacre teaches us that genocide does not require advanced technology or industrial infrastructure. It can be carried out with simple weapons by ordinary people following orders. It teaches us that the dehumanization of victims, describing them as a problem that needs to be solved, is the first step toward mass murder. And it teaches us that silence and indifference in the face of injustice make atrocities possible. The 23,600 Jews murdered at Kamianets-Podilskyi were not statistics. They were real people. Grandparents who had lived full lives, parents trying to protect their children, young people with dreams and futures, and babies who never had a chance to live. Their names are mostly lost to history, their stories untold, their graves unmarked for decades. But their deaths must be remembered, because in remembering the victims of Kamianets-Podilskyi, we honor their humanity and recommit ourselves to preventing such atrocities from ever happening again.